Welcome to today's event with the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles, Being Each Other's Keeper, Allyship and Solidarity in Interfaith Spaces. We're so thankful that you all could join us today because this is a really important conversation that's come at a time of a lot of gathering, a lot of mourning, and a lot of need for justice and accountability. And it's a pleasure to be able to do this event in collaboration with the Episcopal Diocesan Ecumenical and Interfaith Programming Group, as well as with support from the Interfaith Youth Corps' We Are Each Other's campaign, who's provided us some funds to be able to help provide just compensation for our speakers today. The goals of this event are very simple. We'll be starting with this conversation in an in-depth way on allyship between Black local leaders representing various religious and worldview perspectives to lay the foundation for what is and is not allyship. And we'll be building upon the speaker's personal sharings so that you all can have an opportunity to engage in an interactive allyship training. I can tell you right now that Chava, Colleen, and Sable are three people who are really going to take us into a good space with having these kinds of conversations. And I'm really humbled at the opportunity to be able to work with Sable and the team as interfaith ministers for the Episcopal Diocese, with support from Ravi Verma and Bob Williams, who are part of the diocesan working group, and many others in that group as well. So without further ado, Sable, I'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for your attendance. We very much appreciate not only your presence in being here, but also just the inclination to come to any event that is hopefully towards the betterment or greater racial justice for our entire communities. Wherever we might find ourselves, these are important topics to engage in. So we very much appreciate your time and your physical presence. We hope that we can share a bit of ourselves, but also, gain from any insights or any interactions that may come from this gathering together. I want to just a little bit of context setting in how we are talking about, or just the where we find ourselves in beginning this conversation. I would have to say that one of the questions that that might come through or might come up in this, or one of the questions that we are hoping to tackle in one way, is the very big complex topic of racism, and how do you address it when you have experiences of it, both in the microaggressions and in these larger institutional structures that we find ourselves operating in. And for this particular conversation and training, we will focus on the method of allyship. Recognizing that within the American context, white supremacy is the root of what divides communities and maintains racist cultures and systems. All people can and should work towards racial justice. However, it is important to shift the impetus off of minorities to fix the problem and onto majorities, however that might fall within that context, as architects, perpetuators, and benefactors of these systems to also take ownership in the problem. When majority and minority communities work together and there is equity and solidarity, that is when there are most opportunities for allyship. So for today, we really want to explore how we conceptualize allyship, both in how we see it working and in ways in which it may not work, and then definitely ending this event with tools, as we're calling a training of sorts, to greater engage the aspects of allyship that we will touch upon. As a bit of heading into introductions, I will allow my other panelists to also definitely introduce themselves. But I would just kind of say as a context that we find ourselves in different religious communities and in different parts of both identity, and the intersections of these identities are important to take into account. And thus the reason why, as important as it is to mention that Chava is with the Jewish Multiracial Network, and to acknowledge that Colleen has great work with the Poor People's Campaign and the Union of Black Episcopalians, at the end of the day, they are individuals that come to this context in a very personal way. And so we definitely would love to share the professional bios, and I want to acknowledge the great things that these women are doing. However, I also want to allow the introductions to focus on the personal piece and how we find ourselves coming to the conversation. So with that, I will allow Chava to begin with just a bit of a personal introduction, and maybe how you are conceptualizing or looking at allyship in a positive way or positive example.
Sure. So I'm Chava Shervington. I am excited to be a part of this conversation. This is something that I think is really kind of the crux in a lot of ways about like the conversation in a lot of ways to be had when we're talking about race and racism and how to really create change, is how can we all shift our own parts of the world, our own things that we have control and power over in order to make that structural or institutional or systemic change that we're looking for. So I, as an Orthodox Jew who lives in Los Angeles relatively recently, 4 years or so, I think about the different ways in which my identities play together, the different ways in which anti-Semitism impacts me as a woman of color, and also me being a woman of color, how that intersects with anti-Semitism and, you know, gender and all of these things, and how our advocacy is impacted by the fact that, you know, a lot of the social change work and along race in the Jewish community is led by women of color. Like, what does that look like? What is the response? How does that impact the response we get from institutions? So that's kind of how I conceptualize. How does this play out for me? I think that for me, the thing that I love about this conversation is it gives people kind of critical tools to do something in their own world, their own Dalit their own kind of small section. For me, even I was just thinking recently, a friend of mine is an author who writes Jewish children's books and is one of the few that highlights a character of color. And when this national conversation burgeoned in like the last year and a half, she got a lot of requests to write more books. And she said, you know what? I'm not the person that you should be uplifting in this moment. You should be uplifting writers of color. And she put out a call. She said, people are reaching out to me because they're really interested in publishing books. I'm happy to mentor you, edit, whatever can make connections for you, whatever you need to do, whatever assistance that you need in order to utilize the connection she had and the requests that she was getting to actually uplift an author of color in that space. And so I think that that's just a small way that we can all engage in allyship that actually creates some substantial change.
Definitely, thank you. Not only does that give kind of a brief kind of context to some of the ways in which you come to this conversation, but I think that it also is good to begin with positive aspects. As much as we can all learn and grow, I think that it also is good to demonstrate that within our circles, part of the reasons why we care so much about it is because we have seen positive examples of it and how that benefits. So thank you very much for that sharing. With that, I'm going to transition to Colleen, who's going to share a little bit more about her context and a positive example of allyship in her context.
Thank you, Sable and Chava. I'm Colleen Thomas, and I'm grateful to be in this space today with you all, and growing in my own knowledge of the importance of interfaith work in the context of racism and race and reconciliation. I have been active with the Los Angeles Poor People's Campaign for about a year now, and initiated and co-convene our multi-faith working group. And additionally, I serve as a chaplain for the Union of Black Episcopalians. And, in both of those contexts, I'm finding myself wrestling with my own privilege. And I think that an important thing to bring to the conversation of allyship is the necessity of the spaces we occupy and the privilege that we bring to those spaces, and to start from a point of personal growth and education, no matter what your ethnic context is or identity in any framework is. And I also would be remiss not to say that I also have been working in entertainment for the last decade as a television producer. And I think some of what I share may touch on how media impacts our perception of the other, and ways that we can engage media as a way of understanding the other. Positive examples of allyship. I'm encouraged in the last year to see my own church community, All Saints Church, Episcopal Church in Beverly Hills, which is a very privileged, predominantly white community, wrestle with these conversations of race and reconciliation, and also the discomfort that they encounter in confronting their own privilege and white supremacy. And so I'd say the most recent positive example of allyship is both my choosing not to engage in the newly formed racial justice ministry at my church, and allowing my fellow white brothers and sisters to take up that mantle and do the work. And I'd have to say that they're doing a really excellent job of challenging their own privilege. And that, to me, positive allyship from the perspective of a woman of color is allowing those who need to do the work the space to do the work, and not create codependent relationships in that space. I'm grateful to be here, and I look forward to deepening our conversation.
Thank you very much. As a bit of context for myself, as much as I wear the hat of working with Tasneem and Tahil as an Interfaith Minister for the Episcopal Diocese, my primary work is at the University of Southern California in many different ways. Both my dissertation focused on interfaith engagement on campus, and my current work, although I work within a service learning context, I also collaborate with our Office of Religious and Spiritual Life on USC campus, really looking at the religious and spiritual life of our students. Obviously, within the remote context that we've all been in for the past year to 18 months, has really shifted the ways in which we are supporting our students, and even the ways in which we are engaging our professional colleagues. And so I think something that I'll touch upon a little bit more later is just how, with as much as we are heading back to some semblance of normal life and kind of interacting, that we should not lose anything that has kind of been brought up because of our remote living. And the experiences online, similar to our experiences within our professional context, they have highlighted areas in which we can still grow. So I definitely think, or one positive example of allyship that I really am happy to be a part of is I'm working with the Ideals Research Group. They've convened an academic group of about 10 scholars who identify as Black across the nation. And they're looking, the Ideals data, for those who don't know, it is a survey that looked at the experiences of higher ed students. And in again, motivated by some of what has happened in the past year, they've recognized that more can be gleaned from this information if we specifically look at the interaction and the intersection of race and religion. And with the idea that by us examining this data, by us gleaning what the experiences are, we can also hopefully inform our colleagues, we can provide better programming. And so I think that for me, the way in which allyship really has been seen, or the positive things that I've seen from this, is not only the ways in which my colleagues have been allies to each other in this working group, but how we hope to be allies for our students and for our future students by really knowing where we're coming from and using our position as program administrators, as academics, as faculty members, as people of influence on young people, that we are really doing a service to them to make sure that they are also equipped with the tools to be good allies. So with that, we are going to transition a little bit into examples of growth, or basically challenges to allyship. I think many of us have had many interactions where, and it's, you know, bad allyship is not inherently, anything that is a personal attack. Oftentimes, sometimes it stems from ignorance or unawareness, or just the benefit of being insulated by different types of privilege that they've never, that these missteps or these missed opportunities or these kind of fumblings of allyship aren't indicative of who these people are or who they could be. So I think that we are now going to transition into a conversation between us, talking about somewhat areas of challenge of allyship, whether it be through examples and anecdotes of areas of growth and challenge of allyship. And I definitely invite our panelists to definitely respond to each other's comments. So to head in a different direction, I hope, hopefully, Colleen, you are ready to kind of speak about maybe an experience of challenge of allyship, something that you feel is could be used as a growth point for this conversation.
Sure. Well, you know, the most immediate thing that comes up for me as a challenge, especially in faith circles, especially coming from the Christian tradition, is this idea that understanding the difference between charity and justice, and that allyship is not charity. It is not helping the poor. It is not the food banking that we're so good at. And, you know, all these acts of charity that we celebrate in our Christian church context, it can be a huge block to understanding the harsh reality of justice work. You know, it takes incredible commitment and perseverance and discomfort to actually work towards equity and justice. And I find that many Christians in particular really wrestle with this, the do-gooding. And, you know, if we really closely examine the Gospels and look at how confrontational Jesus's ministry actually was, and the charge that we have in that regard to be Jesus's hand and feet in this world, it's going to invite us into some very uncomfortable waters. And we don't really have to give up anything, give up any privilege to make sandwiches for the homeless. So to me, that's one of the biggest challenges in my circles. And I'm sure there are more, but we can come back around. I'm curious to hear what you ladies have to contribute.
So just as a way of kind of responding to that before we move on, I just wanted to, can you say a little bit more about it's not charity. I mean, you obviously charity has its role and its place, but can you say a little bit more about what is problematic about charity being something that I can feel good about, but to your point, not really lose anything?
Yeah.
Why, charity is good. We shouldn't do away with charity. But how can you say a little bit more about what maybe is problematic about the differentiation?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems with the charity mindset is that it's a very personal, private act. It can be. So it can be very individualized. Like it only takes yourself to offer something to someone else. Whereas justice, on the other hand, typically involves working in community and seeing yourself as belonging to something larger than yourself. The charity also, it responds to an immediate need, perhaps, but what it doesn't do is challenge structures and political systems that actually need to be changed. So we don't want to do away with charity, but we also want to recognize that it's more akin to putting a Band-Aid on an issue than actually healing a wound.
Thank you very much for that. Chava, can you share a little bit about maybe an experience that you've had that maybe has been a challenge, or an anecdote that speaks to an area of growth around allyship?
Yeah, so just kind of in response to something that Colleen said, it made me think of this idea. So like in Hebrew, tzedek is justice, and tzedakah is translated as like charity. So like tzedek is something you pursue, like it is work that you're doing, a constant, like it's an action, right? Like it's kind of like some justice is something that you are constantly working toward, and tzedakah can be something that you give, right? And I think that in a lot of ways we conflate tzedakah and tzedek. Like we conflate those two things, and and I think a lot of it is like, why is that? Because the pursuit, the work is always much more difficult than giving, and often giving what is comfortable to us. Like we decide what to give, we decide when to give. All of those things are in our control, whereas we're working, we're pursuing, that's like a larger conversation that requires partners, requires engagement, requires education. So that's just something that I was thinking of. But I think for me, so I do kind of racial equity work in the Jewish community, and I've done that for probably almost 15 years at this point. And one challenge that I find is part of the work of allyship requires reinterpreting or reevaluating your own experience and your own understanding of the world, right? Particularly in spaces where, folks have worked hard, they've had their own personal challenges, they've overcome, they have always tried to do the right thing, and thus they see results, right? And so the world has operated in a certain paradigm and framework that in a lot of ways makes sense, right? You work hard, you achieve, you might have some pitfalls, et cetera, but like consequence and reward makes sense. Your reality and your experience has become universalized, it's default experience. And we've, even in like the initial racial justice kind of dialogue, diversity work, et cetera, like I remember growing up, color blindness was the goal, right? Like that was the goal for everybody to just be like a Benetton Gap ad of racial justice and harmony. And all we had to do was just ignore that people were different colors. And what this conversation, and I think what that attempt at that kind of allyship has exposed is that those skin colors come with different realities. And so how now do I understand that my reality is not the only reality? And I have to now recognize that the world is not as I thought it was, right? And that's a big adjustment that people are being asked to make. Like, I fully recognize that. It is the same way in which people assume the world was flat for thousands of years and that they were going to walk and fall off at some point. And someone said, no, my friends, the world is round. And so we are literally telling people the world is round. There is this whole universe of complex experience, and it's different and difficult, and you might not have been exposed to it. And one, how do I get you to understand and appreciate that? And two, now that you have maybe some understanding, how far does it go? How deep does it go? What does it mean for you as a person who didn't know that before? Kind of, how do you process this in the various ways in which we come and show up? And I think of Jewish communities who America was in a lot of ways the first land in which they were able to achieve Americanness, like a nationality that wasn't just Jewishness. Like, whether, like, this was the Golden Medina. This was a place where people could achieve things and didn't have to face kind of the same level of institutional structures and harassment and oppression from where they come from. And so to say, no, this is not the land of opportunity. This is not for everyone in the same way. This place is not as safe in the same way as it is for you. Like, it causes a real, it requires an entire mindset shift. And how do we come out of that, I think, and how do we respond to that? Is, I think, some of the difficulties of allyship. Like, how easy is that for people to accept? Right? Particularly if you're still not in relationship with a lot of people of color.
Definitely. I find that so interesting, and I really appreciate that you bring that idea up, because again, I think that part of this conversation, or part of the thing that we hope to glean out, is that some of what the work that is being done, it is not inherently all bad, and that really, as much as it is important to combat the obvious aspects of racism and to definitely look at our structures, it is also good to look at well-meaning and well-intentioned initiatives or ideas. And in speaking to the lived experience of these communities of color, in speaking to those that are impacted by them, actually finding out, like, hey, does this concept or does this idea or does this approach actually work for you all? I'm reminded of, within the academic context and the student affairs context, there was this idea that came up about the invisible knapsack. The idea that people, unbeknownst to, until you really kind of start to get into the details of racial identity, that certain people have different things that they, in their toolbox, the kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Not everybody's wearing the same shoes, And I think that it very much gets to your point that I think people, at least students initially, when we did this work, were very defensive of it, because no one wants to feel discredited, but that's not what it is. It is about. It is about acknowledging the difference of one's experience, especially within our context. Even if in their hearts you want everything to be the same, and even if we want all things to be held constant, we are having different experiences. That is just how it is. And when it gets into issues of power and privilege, difference can be acknowledged with, but it's when it gets into power and privilege that it really becomes problematic and needs to be examined. Any other thoughts that you might share about this idea of what is maybe possibly what's better than a colorblind perspective? Would you say, like, how can we get out, or how can we start to acknowledge the lacking aspects of colorblindness?
I mean, for me, a lot of it is what's the like, let's figure out what's the barrier, right? I think a lot of people say there aren't, we have a committee or we have a leadership cycle. There's no people of color here. We need to get people of color here. So let's call the 3 people of color we know, see if they want to be on the committee. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. They say no, then what happens? You still have no people of color in the committee. But no one's ever asked the question, why are there no people of color on the committee? What is the barrier to people of color being on the committee? Why are there no people of color in this room or in that classroom? And the question is, let's figure out why. I think we have started to do some of that, and it's hard, right? Gender equity is still a problem, right? And women are 50% of this, world. And there's still a conversation like, I don't understand why there are no women in positions of, upper levels of leadership. It's like, I don't know, maybe the fact that like our childcare policies are terrible and like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like they don't make the same wages, like women take care of more of the emotional labor. All of these things are not accounted for or like in your institutional structure. So we have to start asking those same questions with regard to people of color. Like, why are they not there? And is it, sometimes I tell people, they're like, oh, we have this really great program. It's a leadership development program. It's specifically for people of color. And they say, it's only like $3,000. And I'm like, who is this for? What people of color is this for? Like, there are also, while there are, incredibly successful people of color, like obviously, but if we're looking to like advance and talk about equity, let's look at kind of the fact that there's a reality that people of color generally have less wealth. So why would you make something incredibly expensive to access? Like, what are the barriers? Like, let's really think about them and figure out kind of what those are, rather than, I think people focus on the goal and not the causes.
The root causes, definitely.
Yeah, like, and this is, it seems relatively obvious, right? Like, what's the root cause of the problem? But the root cause of the problem could be like 4 steps back. It could be, why are people not, at this certain college program? The problem could be an elementary school problem. And how much do we have to delve, and how much do we have to engage with communities? How much do we have to invest in research and kind of think deeply and look at and invest in data? Did people apply? If they applied, did anybody, get accepted? If they didn't get accepted, or if, where is the funnel?
Definitely.
Kind of where does the pipeline go from here to here?
And definitely acknowledging, and I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that at times people benefit from keeping it narrow. There are structures that benefit from like, let's not look into the differences. To your point of it being easier, it is easier to just kind of say like, we're all the same. But the second that you acknowledge that there is difference, if you are a person of value or a person of faith or a person of conscience, the next question is, to your point, why? And once you find out the reasons, can you sit with knowing that people benefit from these structures, or that there is a certain amount of status quo that is benefited from these things? So I think that it is good to ask the why and to acknowledge the importance of the why, and then to also, the caveat is that also the investigation of the why may be difficult for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's hard to capture it, and then sometimes it's because nobody really wants to get into difference. They just rather say, well, we tried and everybody could apply. So again, I'm thinking of Colleen's point of just sometimes we go for the easier concept, or we go for the least complex aspect of the real work, the ways in which charity may be easier than justice, and the ways in which, just kind of, colorblindness is easier than racial justice, and looking at the difference and how far back it may be.
Can I add something to that? I think one of the gifts of, I always say, I love being Black. And one of the gifts of, my Black identity is that as someone who's been othered, it frees me in a way to be other in many contexts. I'm familiar with it, so I don't have a fear of it, which then opens up the world to me. And I think one of the saddest aspects of white privilege is that it's really this deep-rooted fear that keeps your world so small. And there's a gift of acknowledging, of experiencing otherness and having the tools to be in others so that you can occupy many cultural spaces and learn from everybody's difference. And so I think we also need to reframe difference as negative, because there's an association with this colorblind world that to be different is bad, or to be different is limiting, but it's actually very opposite.
Definitely. I'm going to share a bit of an anecdote, which I feel kind of represents, in the same anecdote, both an example of problematic allyship and then also a good example of allyship. Like so many of us this past year, my work has shifted online. And the ways in which, sometimes interactions, they themselves can be, tenuous, even under the best circumstances. But I think we find ourselves in these remote worlds, and go to your point, our worlds are getting that much narrower because we only have this box. I was in a meeting with a number of colleagues. I happen to be the only woman of color on the call. It is a normal academic meeting that meets, and it was a few weeks after the George Floyd murder. There's a gentleman on our staff, a graduate student who we work with, who in the best way possible is very informed and very knowledgeable. He is one to acknowledge his male privilege and is one to acknowledge his white privilege. But as you'll hear from this anecdote, I think that sometimes even the best intentions and the passions can sometimes begin to overshadow the intentions. We were basically done with a lot of our business. And of course it gets onto the topic, just current chit chat that you do in the office. And at that time, I was less informed on the issue of defunding the police, particularly because directly around the George Floyd murder, I personally made the decision that I was going to log off of social media. It was just too jarring. As much as the work needed to be done and as much as the conversations needed to happen, it was just a space that I could not find myself in. So when the conversation got started, again, it begins as like, a casual conversation. And over the course of, I'd say even just a few minutes of talking about it, he was very passionate about actually advocating for defunding the police. He was very much on the right side of the issue, quote unquote, but, or as I kind of felt about it, or ultimately we agreed on it. But in the discussion of it, it ended up being an African-American woman on a Zoom call with other individuals who identified as white, and this gentleman being very passionate about defunding the police and kind of critical of why I would have any hesitancy or why I would not just jump on board. I recognizing that this was not the conversation, and I said, I need a minute, and I logged off very quickly. And I texted my friend who was actually leading the meeting. I said, I'm just going to go grab a slice of pie. I realized like this was not the conversation, and that's fine. So in the time that it took for me to go downstairs and get my piece of pie and come back on and log on, another individual on the call who identified as a white woman. They had somewhat continued the conversation, but definitely in a less passionate context. And she herself was also not disrespectful to the gentleman. And so by the time I logged on, they were kind of winding down this conversation. And we will call her Alice. Alice asked me, she said, hey, Sable, how are you doing? And I said, you know what? I'm good. I have my pie. Don't worry about me. And I was willing in that instance to forego it and just continue on with the meeting. And just, I recognize that in that moment, I needed to kind of decompress, but also maybe this was not, at least at the time, I did not feel it needed to be addressed. And thankfully, Alice very much paused and was like, are you sure? Because I noticed that, that conversation got kind of heated. The benefit of Zoom, if there is a benefit, is that as much as she was talking to me, everybody got to witness the conversation. And so in a very positive way, she inquired about how I was personally doing. She kind of gave me space to kind of give a context for why I felt so kind of jarred by it. And in that, and I will acknowledge that the white gentleman on that call, he was quiet and receptive. I think that he himself also did not realize in the ways in which he had overstepped. And one of the best pieces that I feel Alice demonstrated was a reading of the room. And it was something that I think that she brought up, and not even in an attacking way. And again, by us discussing it, it became about she and I having that conversation. But again, everybody else on the call got to benefit from it. And so what I really appreciated in this example, or the reason why I bring it up, is allyship is not only about passion or about the knowing of an issue or even the fighting for one's issue. I mean, as was brought up, I think it's good to also have allies that when you are tired, it is good to have others that are, righteous indignation or righteous anger. The idea that these are issues that should piss you off. They should make you want to engage in a passionate way. But what Alice demonstrated is that also you have to remember that there are individuals in these conversations, in these meetings, in these instances, in these events, that there is still a human and a personal component to it. That outside of the issue, the right or wrong of the issue, was that she wanted to acknowledge, hey, I noticed that, you weren't feeling that. And also in a polite way, but also in a supportive way, because she and I are friends, not letting me sweep it under the rug and not letting the issue pass without a conversation. And in me being able to express the ways in which I was more particularly triggered by these conversations, everybody benefited. And there was this idea of sensitivity, or there was this idea of awareness. And this, again, as much as in most contexts, I want to just be another colleague, maybe you should think about the Black person on the call when you're talking about, Black issues or things that directly and that can be emotionally or very contentious for one. So like I said, I wanted to use that as my kind of anecdote of highlighting the ways in which not to discredit the gentleman's passion. And like I said, I think afterwards he texted me and he was very appreciative of even the opportunity to learn and recognize that he didn't read the room, that in the earnestness of being so committed to the issue or so committed to justice, he might have missed out on the personal connection to the community member most directly impacted by it. So by Alice's very graceful dealing of it, I felt very supported in that situation. The gentleman had an opportunity to kind of learn or to kind of see the ways in which maybe he could be better. And everybody on the call walked away with this greater awareness, like, hey, I need to be cognizant of just how we engage these topics in general, but especially when we find ourselves in these kind of Zoom world and in these meetings in which it's very easy for it just to be reading articles and, So I just wanted to bring that up as a point of allyship. Chava or Colleen, do you have any thoughts or responses to that?
I mean, one thing I will say is that part of allyship is not about winning arguments, but it's about supporting people. And I think that a lot of times that can get lost in people's desire to do good. And we have to, and it's the way in which people who are not often directly impacted by some of these issues, and you'll see them, they'll just argue about it online, like and it becomes entertainment, it becomes kind of like sports like, and I'm trying to win, you're trying to win. And I think the underlying question is, who is this in service of? Like, what is this in service of? Mm-hmm. Is this in service of the communities or people that I am trying to support? Or is this in service of my ego? And I think that the hard part about this work is there's real ways in which we as people get validated or feel good, or our relationship to this work is how it makes us feel. It makes us feel like we're on the right team. It makes us feel like we're doing good. It makes us feel good. And there's a couple of difficulties and dangers with that. Is like, one, when it stops making us feel good, do we disengage? And then two, it's not about feeling good. It's about work that needs to be done. And the paradigms that need to be shifted, right? So if the way in which you're doing this work still ends up in the dynamic of you as white male shouting down women of color, the paradigm has not shifted. We're still operating in the same frame. You're just changing the words that you're using. And we have to kind of think about, this is a behavioral change. It's not a vocal change. Like, yes, I love when people parrot all the right words and they've got the slogans down pat and they got the statistics and they're coming and they're shooting them out. But if their behavior hasn't changed, if their actions haven't changed, right? It's the same way, like when we think of religious communities, right? When people are not sincerely engaged with any kind of religious philosophy and they're doing whatever they're doing, people are kind of like, whatever, they're doing whatever they're doing. But if someone's like a seriously engaged Muslim or Jew or Christian or whatever religion, and their behavior doesn't seem to be like in service of others, in service of greater good, it looks a lot different, right? Like people judge it just like, well, you're saying you're doing all this work on yourself. You're saying you believe all of these things. Then how come I don't see any of that?
Definitely.
And so we have to take like the same way in which we wouldn't, gossip or this or that, whatever thing that we would also not do because of a sincerely held belief. If this is a sincerely held belief, it should also revolutionize the way in which we engage with other people in the world.
Definitely. I also want to acknowledge that there have been questions in the chat that if we don't get to in this particular section, we will get to after the break. But Colleen, do you have any responses to anything that's been shared in this particular section? Or we can also examine potentially one of the questions before we transition to the break.
I was looking at some of the questions, so I think that's a good idea. Mm-hmm. Actually, I will say, I also, after George Floyd and in my entertainment career, there was this influx, of companies that were showing their support and solidarity of the Black community. And myself and other Black producers that I know were getting kind of overwhelmed by calls and job offers. But similarly to what Chava mentioned, what wasn't happening was this conversation amongst these production companies as to why do we not already have Black producers that can function at this level in our business. And also I was I had a conversation with my agent at the time, because most of the calls that we were receiving as well were to work on Black shows. So suddenly there is an awakening that we're telling all of these Black stories, and we're letting mostly white men, produce these stories. But when it came to a Black producer being offered jobs, I wasn't being offered jobs producing white shows. I was only seen as a Black female producer who understood Black stories, whereas white men and women are assumed to be able to tell anybody's story. And so it's just this idea that we're still being limited to by their understanding of our awareness and our ability to understand a variety of voices and actually create content that is reflective of more of a universal language was very interesting to me.
Definitely. I feel like this somewhat begins to touch upon, or a little bit, it's a tangential parallel question. And when you talk about limitations, how do white people get out of their silos? How can, beyond awareness and being aware, I think another part of the other question that's mentioned is, this if something is espoused, meaning, like similar to what you're saying with these companies, we want to support, Black communities, and it's very much a lot of talking, but there doesn't appear to be action behind it. Do you all have any reflections or thoughts about the questions related to advice for breaking white people for specifically breaking out of silos, or how we might also deal with those that are speaking to one kind of intention, but as you're saying, not doing the real work behind the scenes, or 3 steps behind?
I think one of the ways that the silos can be broken is to open the door. I think it's just very convenient to wind up in comfortable spaces in which everyone is like you. I tend to be intentional about putting myself in spaces where I tend to be the only melanated person present. And sometimes it's just fun. I sing in an a cappella group, but that's just fun. But also most of those women who sing with me are Republicans. And so there then comes an opportunity for them to actually hear in the fun guise of singing of some different positions, some different ways, some different points of view. Or when I'm in my knitting group, definitely I tend to be the only person melanated there on multiple levels, but we can have kinds of conversations where I can gently redirect them that we do not have to talk about my name. It doesn't have to be the subject of conversation. And I'm doing doesn't have to be the subject of conversation. We can actually just have a knitting group for make a different one, and focus needs to be on me. But I have to be responsible enough to take the leadership position. It's actually okay for us to all do it. And I think that's just an additional step that needs to be taken. And non-melanated people stay in their silos because the silos were built for them, and there are benefits to staying in them. And so you have to wake up in the morning and decide that today I'm going to look someone who does not look like me in the eye and speak. Because culturally, that's appropriate. We speak to strangers when we walk down the street. If they look like us, we say hello. And to not be put off by the defensiveness that will come up, because I certainly would be taken aback if a white person just walked up to me and said good morning. I would be questioning that. But it will be normalized if you continue to do it. You would become more comfortable, and the people around you will become more comfortable. So I think a lot of times that there are opportunities in allyship conversations where people who are not melanated often are saying, what can we do? What can you do? But you do whatever you need to do that you would do to resolve any problem that you have. Any solution that you're looking for. And you would do it in unique and creative ways because that's what solutions look like. And I think that the responsibility does not need to be burdened upon those of us who are already oppressed and suffering, because it's very personal for us. And so we have to wake up every morning and pretend like it's not personal. We have to wake up every morning and pretend like George Floyd was not my uncle, was not my brother. As we have these conversations of vaccinations, I have to pretend like my girlfriend's dad, who's blind because of the Tuskegee experiment, didn't happen, as we casually violate HIPAA confidentiality about our vaccinations and actually start talking about people are going to be forced to be vaccinated. I have to then pretend like in my demeanor that we were not forced to be vaccinated in the Tuskegee experiment, and it went really, really bad with syphilis. And so I think that the opportunity for white allyship to bear the burden that we've always had to carry alone is now here. And to do that, you have to be brave. You have to be strong. You have to talk to people who don't look like you. Say, okay, Google, and talk about conversations with African Americans and other people of color, not just how to get to the latest restaurant. I think that those are some of the tasks that will allow you to come out of the silos and to break them. And to participate in a melanated world that has always been. This is not a new place, and participate in dismantling oppression that has always been. And I think that those are ways that silo breakage can take place.
Definitely. Thank you for your feedback and for your reflections on that. We will definitely, just as a way of transitioning, we are going to head into a break in a few minutes. But before that, I would like Colleen or Chava, if you have any final thoughts for this particular section.
Yes, I did want to respond to the how do white people get out of their silos. And in this entertainment framework that I was just speaking about, I often find myself, because I'm asked, what can I do to help, or what can I do? Well, I find myself encouraging my white friends to just engage in media where whiteness is not centered. And it's fascinating to me how, I have a dear friend who loves movies as much as me. And I'm one of those people who will, like, every nominated film, when it's award season, it's like, I gotta watch it. So I watch everything. I watch, films where there's no female lead characters, and I watch films where there's not a single Black person. But just recently, it dawned on me that, one of my friends has seen almost every movie that I've seen, but hadn't seen United States versus Billie Holiday, and hadn't seen Regina King's One Night in Miami. It's one really, really simple and less challenging way, I think, to understand allyship, which first starts with understanding yourself and your own bias. Is just, you don't even have to leave the house. Just make an intention to watch a film, and you don't have to watch 13th, you don't have to watch 12 Years a Slave, just watch anything where you don't see yourself in it, because Black people do that all the time. But it really can help to develop a comfort with the other in a very, very simple way.
I think that's a great piece of advice. Not only is it a quote unquote safe experience of otherizing, or participating in being another, or what it might be, but I think that it also it provides insight. Again, not every Black movie is representative of every Black person, and even to your point, I think that even when you look at even what stories are out there, I mean, we might have to engage and search a little bit more to find even those narratives that deviate from kind of the classic toxic tropes that we see. The Black community, like all communities, have complexities and intersections. And so I think that it is good that we not only inform ourselves and make ourselves knowledgeable of certain experiences or certain ways in which those experiences are showcased. But also, I think I love what you're saying in the sense of just the practice of participating in something where you don't see yourself. It may be a new experience or something that others aren't used to. And in experiencing it themselves, might have a little bit more empathy or a little bit more awareness of the perspective of the other. Chava, any final thoughts as we conclude this section?
I was going to echo a lot of that around the creating an intention around exploring spaces and places and things in media that don't center or default to kind of like the white experience. And also experiencing and discussing and learning about Black people or people of color in ways that don't deal with race and racism. I feel that there is also a way in which, because of the urgency, the explosion of this conversation in like a way where people have felt like a need to respond, is that we run into an issue where the only time people want to talk about Black people is when they're talking about race or racism, not when they're talking about art, not when they're talking about fashion. Everybody talks about Beyonce, so I'm just gonna like leave the music out of it. But there are just certain ways in which we are absent when we're talking about any subjects other than like being victims of police violence. And Black people are good at so many things and have so many things to offer the world other than being the victims of racism. And so how can people create some type of intention to learn about all of those other things, right? All about the technology, the inventions, the music, the art. There's just so many things that they don't have access to, or that there's so much creativity and art and humor and all of these things that I am like very privileged to know about. And then, I'll tell somebody and I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this YouTube show. It's amazing. And they're like, what are you talking about? I've never heard of that. I'm like, we like all the same things. Why haven't you heard of that? And it's because of this discomfort with placing ourselves in situations in which we're not the default. Look, even back in law school, the Black Law Student Association would have all these like study groups and things and whatever. And they were the best things in law school for preparing for exams. And there were always white students who were just like, is it going to be more than Black people? Because I don't want to be the only white person there. And I'm like, you're willing to get a lower grade and thus potentially less job opportunities because you are uncomfortable about being the minority in a room. I was like, Black people could never, and just kind of taking ownership of just like that discomfort and exploring new things, and also just willing to cede space, right? When somebody asks you to do something or they ask you to present or lead or whatever, ask them who else they've spoken to. Have they spoken to someone else of a different race or color? Like, ask the question. Put the onus on them. I'm not saying you have to offer someone. Just ask.
Definitely.
If you make that a practice, it's going to force people out of their silos because they're going to want to say no. People don't want to say no to that question in this moment. Like, make them change their no to a yes.
Definitely. With that, we are going to have a brief break. In the next section, we will be doing a training, but also I also have been seeing that we have a very active chat. So we will also try to, please hold us accountable. We will try to save room at the end for final comments and questions from that might engage some of the questions or anything that we don't attend to in the next section of our training. So Scouts Honor, everybody take a few minutes to stretch. But come back here, I'm going to say at 2:08, knowing that, there might be some melt, but 2:08 is the number in your mind. 2:09 now, but we will be starting not too soon thereafter, 2:09. So we will be reconvening, and everybody can head on back. We will be starting in a few moments. If we can have our panelists back, great. So for this next section, what we will be doing is we've obviously talked about a lot of important topics and things that have come up. In this next section, which we are kind of considering the training aspect of it, recognizing that, these are complex ideas that are ongoing and contextual. So we have tried to pick out a few points. Each of us will speak about 3 points that we kind of feel are key takeaways, right? Recognizing that, again, this is a complex subject that is also very contextualized to your particular community, your particular religious perspective. So, but we tried to make our advice or these little key insights something that can be applied in many different contexts. So with that, we are going to put a few slides up just so that you all have something to kind of follow along with. But I believe Chava is going to start us off, and Tahoe, if you could transition us to the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so a thing about me and the way kind of like I approach this work is I am a lawyer and very much about concrete tools and guidance, because I find that when I have conversations about allyship, people are like, what do I do though? Like, tell me what to do. And I think that in a lot of ways we know what to do, but this is kind of, you know, giving ourselves permission to act in the ways in which we can act. Allyship is a verb, right? It's not a noun. I think people designate themselves as allies because they support justice, whatever that means. They support equity, but in a lot of ways, their support of justice means I'm support Black people doing whatever they need to do to be free. But the reality is Black people don't often control the levers that we need to get free. So what does that mean? What are the ways in which we can change our own world in order to influence structures, right? And so there's something that I kind of call like your own personal pocket of power, right? There is something in this world that we have control over. It might not be huge. It might not be, we might not be the head of a company, but even librarians help choose books, right? What are the books that we're choosing? Who are the authors that we're highlighting? Teachers develop curriculums. Whose contributions are we highlighting? What lessons are we learning? Parents can buy dolls, choose to have their kids participate in extracurriculars in more diverse neighborhoods. Executive assistants have control often of purchase power, right? Graphic designers, the images that they use. I remember there's a really large organization, and they just had a multiracial Jewish image on one of their standard Rosh Hashanah cards. And there was nothing about race. There wasn't anything about racial equity. It was just a multiracial image, which is something that is not as common in Jewish communal space. And the next time I saw him, I said, hey, I don't know if you know this, but that's an image that got shared a lot. It meant a lot to people to be seen, that the community didn't see them as invisible. And so I wanted to kind of like, thank you for doing that. And he was like, really? He was like, I feel terrible because it wasn't intentional. He said, the reality was the different complexions looked really good on the color backdrop that we had selected, which is how that happened, right? He said, but now that you've told me how important it was for people to feel seen, I will make sure that we are intentional about that in the future. And this is just like a guy in graphic design made a decision. And so now the images that are broadcast by one of the largest organizations in the Jewish world are more diverse than they were, because of one guy who decided to use that personal aspect of his own power. And then the other thing I would say is if you see something, say something. This is the part I feel like where this all gets tricky, right? Nobody wants to be that person. Allyship can be uncomfortable because there might be that really great, nice person who contributes a lot to the community, who does a lot of charity work, who serves on a lot of boards, who says some really offensive things, or says some things that are well-intentioned but are offensive. And nobody wants to be that person because they're not a bad person. Maybe they don't know, maybe they haven't been exposed. We make all kinds of justifications in our head about why we shouldn't say something to the person who said something offensive. But really what you're doing in a lot of those cases by not saying something is you're not letting the person know that what they're saying is not acceptable in this environment. So you're creating an environment where certain types of comments, behaviors, etc., are deemed acceptable. And also you put the onus on the target of bias to speak up, right? We might all see something and be like, ooh, that's offensive. And nobody says anything, nobody says anything. So the Black person is like, well, I have to say something because it's offensive to me. And then later on, everybody's like, oh, I'm so glad you said something because that was so offensive and terrible. I just didn't know what to do. And how we are remaining bystanders rather than kind of standing up and saying, no, this is a problem. If we continue to put the onus on people of color to be the ones to say something, to note discrimination, to say, hey, there's a racially tinged image that, makes me feel uncomfortable. We're not being an ally. We're sympathetic, but we're not an ally, because an ally is going to say, I'm not going to wait or rely on this person of color to say something, but I am going to speak now. Because what happens also, like there's the systems and dynamics when the person of color is always agitating, right? When they're always saying this is racist, this is offensive, etc., it starts to get taken less seriously and they become that person. And so not only is our sympathy creating inaction, it is actually creating harm because it is shifting the perception of how that person of color is seen in that environment, in that community. Another thing that I just always tell people, sometimes you have to step back to move forward. Sometimes it requires ceding our voice, right? Some of us are really used to being heard and really used to our voice being important and authoritative and universal. And when we're asked to lead, when we're asked if, who else's voices have been solicited, when we're talking about panels, have a position that like, we're not gonna have a panel unless there's a person of color on this panel. Make decisions at an institutional or structural level about whose voices are required to be there for this to be a real conversation. Part of the issue with allyship and solidarity and how integral this work is to people's mission, right, is the voices of people of color are still seen as optional, right? We are optional and we are nice to have. We're like, if they have sprinkles, fantastic. If not, I want the ice cream anyway. You know what I mean? But like, we need to stop being the sprinkles or the chocolate chips on top, but like the ice cream. We are the ice cream you went to the store to get. We are the ice cream that is the part of the community. So if that's the reality, that means that the work isn't done, the program isn't planned, the conversation isn't final unless the voices of people of color have been solicited and heard. And so I think that, kind of those are like my three just always like big action items is you know, make the change you can be. If you are in a place of institutional power, use it. Don't wait for permission. There are a lot of ways that people can make change that does not require a board decision. You know, so many people are waiting for the board to make a decision that racial equity is a priority, or the university to kind of create or finalize their initiative, or this company to sign off on the logo that matches the initiative, whatever it is, right? But there's ways that you can create change in those institutions without anybody signing anything. Use that power. I mean, I stole this from the subway. If you see something, say something from New York City. Like, it is what it is. And cede space when you have the opportunity to do.
Thank you. We will transition to Colleen. And again, these aren't meant to reduce the complexity of these topics. These are meant to just give you something that you all can take home, or something that you all can kind of think about and ruminate, and hopefully simple enough that that you can apply it to your situation, but also important enough because these have been identified as helpful in allyship. Colleen.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I started where I've already talked a bit about this. Examine your relationship to charity, and how allyship is not charity, and understanding the difference between charity and justice. Tahil, can you share the other slide? Here we go. I thought this was a very helpful and clear breakdown of the differences between charity and justice. Charity as a social service that provides direct services, food, clothing, shelter, versus justice as social change, not service. Justice promotes change in institutions or structures. Again, as a Jesus follower, we see in the Gospels the both and, but I often reflect on the Beatitudes, and what the Beatitudes are an extreme, they're speaking to social change, a reframing of how we see the world, and in particular, coming from the Poor People's Campaign, a reframing of how we see the poor, right? Blessed are the poor, Jesus says. Well, we as a society tend to blame poor people for their own poverty. That's quite a different framework than what we are challenged with in the gospel. Charity responds to immediate needs. Jesus did that too. But justice responds to long-term needs. And we were commissioned by Jesus to change our minds and the way that we think about other people, the way we think about our relationship to power and to money and to resources in general. Charity is directed at the effects of injustice, its symptoms, addressing problems that exist. And I like this expression, love mops up. Whereas justice says justice tries to make sure the mess isn't made to begin with. Again, what are the underlying structures or causes of these problems? Like Chava's been asking us, not just we need more Black people at the table, but why are there no Black people at the table? Why are Poor People's Campaign statistic 60% of Black people poor and low income? Why? Justice aims to get to the root causes of our social problems. Charity is private individual acts. I think it's a character flaw, again, of our Christian institutions. Just the emphasis on personal piety. We're easily satisfied if we've done good. And And if we are good ourselves, we are good with God. But justice is public and it's a collective action. So we're not just good with ourselves, our neighbors have to be good too. You know, I often say, like, I'm extremely comfortable, but I'm extremely uncomfortable so long as my brothers and sisters are uncomfortable. Justice says, okay, love your neighbor and really be concerned about the state of your neighbor, not just your own ability to say, well done, self. Okay, and then, you know, these have been mentioned, but examples of charity, homeless shelters, food shelves, clothing drives, emergency services, and then justice is legislative advocacy, changing policies and practices, political actions. And this can challenge us, understandably, because, you know, it also brings up, justice can evoke in us a sense of inadequacy, right? Well, I don't know anything about advocacy. I don't know anything about political systems. I don't know political organizations to get involved in. Well, I didn't know either. I joined the Poor People's Campaign and I'm learning. Okay, so that's number one. To heal, thank you. We can go back. Okay, so then number two is make a conscious intention to live incarnationally. What does this mean? Well, Jesus lived incarnationally. The whole Christian idea of God sending himself into the world was because in our Christian context, even God tried to fix and change things and realized, you know what, I got to be in there with them and understand their suffering. And I always like to remind people of this definition of compassion, because I strongly believe that solidarity means living compassionately, but compassion comes from the Latin word compati, which means to suffer with. So, you know, we're talking about beyond sympathy, which is feeling for someone and feeling the sense of pity. I'm so sorry this happened to you. Black women, I can speak for myself. I hear this a lot whenever there's a racial issue in our society. What can I do? Let's break up with sympathy and start a new relationship with empathy, which is sharing or experiencing the feelings of another, and put yourself in places where you are the other. Back to what I was sharing earlier, I think of how my being othered has given me the privilege and the comfort of being able to be other in other spaces. So I spent 5 months a couple of years ago in Oaxaca, Mexico. There are no Black people in Oaxaca. I might have saw a couple Black people in Mexico City, huge city. Before that, I went to Rome for the first time. I really honestly don't think I saw a single other Black person in all of Rome. And so, you know, this ability to understand, and now I had a choice when I was there to feel like the other and see the differences, or to put myself in a position of learning about the history of these people and observing and learning. What I noticed in Oaxaca was that there were other Americans there. I had neighbors in the Airbnb where I was staying upstairs. They were a white couple. They were having a really difficult time in Oaxaca because Oaxaqueños, they're not they don't care about you. They're not checking for you. You know, they are friendly, but they're not, it's not a touristy place where they're looking to approach Americans and you know, sell you things, and they're not fascinated by American culture. And I think that being one of the effects of white privilege is becoming used to being seen. And so if you're not seen, it's extremely uncomfortable. Well, I live in Venice. You know, there's some Black people here, but not many. I'm not seen every day. So I was able to enjoy myself in Oaxaca where no one saw me, and appreciate the gift of anonymity that comes from nobody caring who you are or what you do. But I found that that was extremely comfortable for some of my white counterparts there. So, and then this aspect of experiencing the feelings of another, it allowed me to really lean into the indigenous experience and the racial structures that are there in Mexico, that indigenous people in Mexico, it's a very striking class system there. And if I was consumed by my own experience of not being seen, I don't know if I would have noticed the struggles and the identity challenges that Mexicans also have to face on a daily basis. And then lastly, I would encourage us to get comfortable with your own powerlessness. You know, allyship requires more learning about yourself, and it also demands, I would say, confronting feelings of guilt and shame or a sense of inadequacy that are going to come up. And here's where I think many people turn back from this work, because, you know, if you feel like you can fix something or control something or change something, you can stay in it, you can stay in the work. But if you cannot acknowledge your own relationship to racism, nationalism, privilege, homophobia, xenophobia, guilt and shame are going to paralyze you in one or two ways. You're going to withdraw, or like Chava was talking about, or maybe it was Sable, that ego is going to really interfere with your ability to be in real relationship with others, and do the important work of examining your relationship to charity, like we've mentioned, and justice, but also your own privilege. And I unfortunately inherit nationalism and racism. You know, I have myself spent, I think, more of my life occupying white spaces. And even I am making conscious choices to live incarnationally, to think about how I can occupy spaces where there are poor and people of color and unhoused people. I had one other thought that I wanted to share, but maybe it will come back to me. I think the most important thing we can do is start with ourselves, because taking action from a place of guilt or denial, that's not going to be helpful to anybody. So
thank you. Thank you for that. And definitely, if it comes to you, we can, there will be hopefully a section for question and answers and comments. So definitely. I will move on to a few points that I have, or some key takeaways that I would love for you all to think about as we leave this space. As was kind of brought up with my my particular anecdote, was that knowledge is good, and this was actually touched upon by Colleen, but that empathy is better. In the sense that it is, while it is important in some regards to be knowledgeable on a particular issue, or at least have a certain amount of baseline knowledge, it is so important, or I would say much more important, rather than being an expert, what was Chava brought up, rather than you trying to win a particular argument, that to remember that there are people involved in all of this, and that they really, that connecting on a human level. I think that many people are happy for support, or that they can recognize authenticity. They can appreciate support, even in saying, hey, I'm just going with my best intention. Even if it is, even if it is not the most scholarly, to definitely recognize that there is a willingness, and I think that that's what many people will appreciate. Next, I want to talk about the importance of checking in and listening. I underline listen because I think that it's two-part, both in thinking about how you can check in specific situations, in reading the room, but also what was kind of brought up is that in our earnestness of being more aware of our otherness, that will also hopefully allow us a frame to by also allowing there to be a way of connecting with the personal piece of it, basically having it so that there is an awareness that, hey, if there are situations in which I might be comfortable, let me also think about how one might be comfortable in all of these situations, or how others might be comfortable or uncomfortable in my situation, or in the situation that I find myself in. And recognizing that particular issues are particularly triggering. So it can certainly be an aspect that we can allow to frame our experiences, so that we are cognizant when, hey, I noticed that my friend kind of stopped speaking a little bit, or I noticed that, whether it be in the physical body language, that, hey, maybe something about this situation is uncomfortable for this individual. As was brought up in the sense that previously, that that when you're paying attention, hopefully, you are you have an opportunity to advocate, or to, if nothing else, just pull that friend aside and say, like I said in my particular example, the individual Alice, she really checked in and she listened, and she didn't let me shy away from that. She listened, and she made sure that others took the time to listen. Let's see. So finally, use your position to signal boost and to bring awareness, whether by accident or by design. There are issues that exist that are able to persist because they're easily ignored. And so while it is still important to obviously advocate to make sure that you are not speaking on behalf of any other individual, that using your position to promote awareness and advocacy can disrupt these systems that will otherwise go unacknowledged. And so I think that it's important to definitely use your position to signal boost and to bring awareness to issues, in the sense that if something is not sitting right. But I think that it is also important to cede your time to others, to check in the emotional components piece, the personal pieces of it. I think that in all of our situations, small acts of kindness, small ways in which you signal boost a person's point, or in which you affirm that they are not, that is not just them. It goes back to the point of avoiding the onus being on the minority person, because then it's easy to dismiss it. Oh, they're just being angry. Oh, they don't. Oh, they're just sensitive. I think that a part of allyship is using your position to co-sign on certain things, to check in, to listen, and to definitely recognize and acknowledge the importance of empathy. So with that, we can take the slides off the screen. We will definitely also be sending out the slides along with other resources so that you all feel confident that you all can continue to reflect upon these points. But also we do have a bit of time that we do want to offer for questions. If any of the panelists would like to speak to some of the other questions that were brought up, but that maybe we wanted to get into just a little bit more detail. I know that in the last section, I believe a question was related to working with individuals or places that say that they want things, but maybe aren't as receptive. Or any other, Colleen, if your other point came to you, or if Chava, you'd like to add anything to the kind of key takeaways that we hope that people recognize. Oh, yes, here it is. The question, how does one seek allyship when others voice desires to do so, but provide no action in what they desire? Yes, also related, how can I make sure that I don't tokenize or perform, but honestly engage and give others the platform? I think that something that I'd like to add to the question related to voice desires to do so, but no action. I also recognize that it is labor to constantly follow up with somebody, or to help or to try to help people be accountable to what they've said that they've done. And so I think that my kind of advice or my perspective on that is slightly twofold. I think that in some situations, people feel paralyzed due to lack of knowledge, fear for being uncomfortable. There are many different reasons in which there is genuine reasons for hesitancy. There is a difference between, I don't know what to do, I'm paralyzed, I don't want to be wrong, I don't want to step on any toes, so I don't know how to move, versus just a lot of hot air. Or this, I want to perform the fact that I am woke. I want to perform the fact that I have Black friends. I want to perform. And really it is just a bunch of hollow air and hot air. And if I might be so frank, those individuals may or may not be worth your time and effort. But I think that that kind of going back to what was brought up by Chava, this investigating the why. If a person has espoused a desire and they didn't come to the event, or if they've espoused a desire but didn't quite, vote on the initiative, or didn't quite, send you in a diverse image, just kind of in so much as possible, asking them, like, investigating the why. If it is lack of tools, that is manageable. If it is fear or concern, I mean, there are ways in which you can work through a genuine desire, but the action is due to lack of information, awareness, or comfortability in a situation. And so I think that investigating the why can help give insight to why they're espousing desire, but not acting upon it. If you do find that it is a bit of hot air, I would say that time and effort is better spent towards either your own self-care, which is always important, or towards others that are actually showing up, not recognizing that, you're not leaving anybody behind. And when that individual is ready, they will still get an invite to the event. But that maybe you can't, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So thinking about how you can investigate authentic desire, or kind of evaluate a true heartfelt desire versus somebody who's maybe just trying to impress either themselves or others. Do my panelists have any other thoughts?
Yes, I to respond to Lynn's question, I'm led to respond that, I think becoming an ally is a bit of a spiritual journey, and there's probably phases of like we have stages of grief and awakening and loss of an idea, and even though this is very urgent work, it's also long haul work. And so it's really frustrating to want to also see our, potential allies as with our own sense of compassion. But I think that we have to, especially if we are called to occupy predominantly white spaces, there might be a reason why we find ourselves, like I've wrestled with that too, like, why am I in this predominantly historically white faith tradition? And I've just accepted and embraced it as a calling, which means that God is giving me the grace to navigate relationships with people who are other than me and are also on this spiritual journey of becoming something other than they are. So I think that we have to allow people and allow the Spirit to do the work of not only inviting them to become an ally, but also allow the Spirit to the work of changing their minds and the way that they think.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I would, from the question, the dynamic of the relationship isn't entirely clear, but I know that there's difference between you're seeking allies to move the congregation forward or to move a community forward, and when the community is kind of saying all the right things but not doing anything. And I think that part of it is knowing like where the tension spots are. Like sometimes there's will, but there's particular tensions, as Sable mentioned, that are just hard for people to get past or get around. And maybe it's finding some alternate routes, like maybe there's a different path. But also, yeah, and this is something that I've had to learn as part of like this process of like being a community educator, is one, not every space is ready for you. And you cannot expect certain things from certain spaces, and understanding what people can provide and what they're not ready to yet provide, and finding ways in which to find those supports in alternate spaces and settings until you can get it there. I think that what happens is that a lot of people who are in predominantly white faith traditions, or like there, not a lot of people of color or Black people specifically in them, get discouraged because they can't find they don't have that analogous experience with people in their community. They can't share certain experiences. Their community can't respond to them in certain ways. And it might require kind of carving out your own spaces and carving out specific places where you can get that support until your community is ready. And that's also, just kind of a reality, because you want people to engage in this work the right way. Because what can happen, and this kind of talks like another question I've seen coming in, is like the tokenization, right? They find the one person of color and they're done. Zehu, we have found her, we have found him, and then like there's diversity and we're diverse and this person doesn't have racism and we haven't done anything structurally to change anything for a host of people, but like we're now diverse. So I think that it doesn't serve anyone in the long run to rush people through this process. I think there has to be acknowledgement, education. People have to move out of like that place of defensiveness, acknowledging that it's a process, and then figuring out like what they can do and when they can do it and what they're ready for. Because otherwise we get into situations where we paint pieces different colors, but we don't change structures. And that's not equity. It's maintaining the same, it just maintains a situation where there happen to be people of color who are naturally more comfortable in predominantly white spaces, who have access to power and access to money and all of the other things that are not necessarily typical, maybe, that can find a way to navigate your space. And therefore the institution doesn't have to change, structures don't have to change, nothing has to change for that person to exist and to be comfortable there. Like, that's not the goal. The goal is shifting there's this analogy is like, it's like kind of if somebody asks you to a dance at a different school, right? Like someone asks you to prom at a different school. You've been like, there's this one person who got asked to prom and they could go and they could have a great time. But what does it look like to have a joint prom with like these two different schools? And like, what do they have to change in order to make the situation work for both schools so that everybody's comfortable? Do they have to change the DJ? Do they have to change the theme? You know, like what has to change in order for everybody to feel comfortable? And so as long as you're asking those questions of like, have I had to change anything about my community to make this person feel comfortable? If the answer is no, odds are you haven't done enough. You're not where you need to be. So to think of it like that, and you miss out. And I like, you know, and I always tell people like there's so much music and wisdom and creativity and color and art that our communities are missing when people of color aren't there. Like, it's not just, it's nice for people of color to be at our church, synagogue, etc. Like, that's not the dynamic. It's not a nice thing that you're doing for other people to include them into your community. It's our community is inherently lacking because these people are not here. Like, what have people of color given to American culture, right? From music to food to art to politics to, you know, religious philosophy. If all of that, like, if your community doesn't have a jazz or a blues or a hip hop or a rock and roll, like, what are you missing? Like, what could be philosophically, theologically altering and mind-blowing that is absent because there's a crucial demographic missing from your community? And understanding that it's not just their loss that they can't sit in your pews, but it's your loss that they're not in your pews.
Definitely. I think that those are great points. I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. So we are going to at least begin wrapping up things. Again, I think more than anything else, as many who are involved in this work know, that it is not solved in an afternoon. It is ongoing. It is evolving. It is something that we must investigate ourselves. It is something that we must also, continually check in, continually inform ourselves, reach out, rest when needed, but also, inform ourselves and continue to evolve to the situation so that we can better serve our communities. I would like to say thank you so much to our panelists. I apologize if we didn't get to all of the questions, but we will be sending out resources afterwards to make sure that we can continue the conversation. Certainly continue to put your information or any other questions or anything else into the chat if you all would like to just continue to stay engaged in this conversation and these topics. We will also be on the lookout as Interfaith Ministers. We will be doing a few other events related to this topic, but also engaging other topics that we feel might be most relevant. Before I transition to Tahel and Tasneem to close us out, or with any of their final thoughts, I want to provide just a few, 1 or 2 minutes for our panelists. Anything else that you would like to conclude with, or any information that you would like to share about yourselves to make sure that our participants walk away with?
You know, nothing more about myself, but since I have a minute, I did want to respond and add to Chava and Tahil's question in particular. I was just starting to respond in the chat, but as far as, you know, doing the work of centering Black voices and what interfaith spaces might be lacking, I wanted to add that when we invite Black people into spaces, we have to let us be Black. And, you know, one of my favorite examples of this was our Bishop Michael Curry, at the royal wedding. And it was the best moment ever, because even I'm watching this like cringing, like, Bishop, you're getting real Black. I don't know if they're ready for this. But when we show up, we've got to also be able to bring all of our culture, all of our oratory style, all of our praying style, our music choices, that beautiful gospel choir that was at the royal wedding. Like, and it makes people uncomfortable though. And so, you know, just let us be Black and, you know, big and glorious and fiery and everything that makes people uncomfortable about Blackness. And yeah, that's my final thought.
I like it. Chava, any final thoughts or any concluding responses?
No, I thought Colleen's comment was amazing. You know, it's like, know that when you're truly in allyship, your spaces will look different.
Yes.
They will feel different.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reality, right? It's not going to feel the same. It's not just not going to look the same. It's not going to feel the same. It's not going to sound the same. And that is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, it might be uncomfortable, and that process of getting to that space might be uncomfortable, and you might have some discomfort with that, but that's the goal, right? Like, if you are really, really engaged deeply in allyship in a way that people of color feel comfortable, not only to be in your space, but to be who they are in your space, right? Like, wow, like that, my friend, like, that's the goal.
Definitely. So we would also like to acknowledge everyone who showed up. We thank you so much, everyone who has watched and who has participated actively in the chat or has just received what we've had to offer. Again, we will be following up with everybody who is in this particular, who we have your information to send you the slides and to send you to some other valuable resources. We appreciate your presence. We are very grateful to the Episcopal Diocese that allow Tasneem, Tahil, and myself to do programs in this particular capacity, and to IFYC for a bit of funding and related to these topics, recognizing that these are important conversations. Thank you to our panelists. Tahil and Tasneem, do you have any other final thoughts before we let everyone go?
I'll just echo the thank yous, the gratitude, the lessons, the wisdom. And I'll just add one more question to the chat for us to just take with us, and feel free to answer in the chat if you feel called, but really it's our own work, right? And so my response to it is, I'm taking Chava's question of, have I really had to change anything in my home, in my community, in the places that I work at? And I'm going to be reflecting on that a lot. And the chances are there might be some, but there haven't been enough. And so there is a lot more for me to do, and I'm going to be seeing what those things are. And I invite you to be in this work with us together, and look forward to being in community with you again. So yay.
I also want to echo both what Sable and Tasneem said. Chava and Colleen, thank you for what you brought into the space. Thank you for the subtle and the straightforward reminders of what this work of solidarity and being an accomplice looks like. And I want to thank Sable and Tasneem for making this work so worthwhile, because we get to learn from the wisdom of various traditions and various people in what we need to center in finding the dignity in every human being. And I want to just remind everyone of a couple of things. First, because this call has been recorded, it's going to be on YouTube and on Facebook. So we'll be sure to share the links in our follow-up so that you can share it with other people and watch stuff to like really think about all of the heavy hitting stuff that we've learned today. And two, please make sure you save the date for our next event. We do have another event coming up related to this series, which is our Interdependence Walk. It's been a part of the tradition for the last several years of the diocese to work with interfaith partners to do what would be a very physical walk around Echo Lake in downtown Los Angeles. But because of COVID restrictions and restrictions on Echo Lake itself, we'll be doing another virtual program that's going to continue centering Black voices of faith. So please be on the lookout. As you've registered with us, we'll be sharing more information on July 4th is when we'll be doing the event at the same time, 1 p.m. So look out for details for that. And we want to thank everyone so much for coming, and hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Definitely. Thank you all. Thank you very much.